We need to get you an elevator, Auntie, I think. Or a forklift.
I need a bit of air anyway.
Thank you. I'm here tonight with three Joneses. I'm here tonight with Kelly Jones from Clark's Beach and her niece and nephew, Kyle and Kelsey Jones. And Kyle and Kelsey's grandfather was George Jones, who was from Riverhead in Brigus. But his mother and his grandparents were from here in Coley's Point, Little John's from Coley's Point. And George would tell me stories about how when he was a boy, he used to walk from Brigus to here. He would walk over to visit his grandfather Little John. And his grandfather would tell him story after story, ghost story. And then he would have to walk home in the dark all the way back to Brigus. I never met the grandfather. He died long before I was born. But anyone who tells kids ghost stories and then sends them to walk for miles in the dark, I kind of like. George had all kinds of stories that he learned from his grandfather. He said walking home, he would always be terrified to walk past the graveyard in North River because his grandfather had said that there was a ghostly funeral that would take place there every night at 4 o'clock. He had stories about the fairies, too. He had stories about what he called a little fella, jack-o'-lantern, that he had seen as a boy in Brigus. And Margaret asked me if I'd tell a fairy story tonight. I'm going to tell a story from, actually, Kelly's aunt, her Aunt Betty Slaney, who was from Britannia on Random Island. And there weren't a lot of fairy stories from Random Island, but this was one that her aunt told me that was a true story, a story that had happened when she was growing up in the years before Confederation on Random Island. And it was about her aunt, Aunt Betty's aunt, Aunt Sadie Curry. Aunt Sadie Curry had been married to Uncle Mose Curry. Uncle Moses had died fairly young. He'd gone out one night and had had a heart attack on the road and had died. And for years later, Aunt Betty said that as a girl, she was terrified to walk along that section of road because Uncle Mose's ghost would appear where he had died on the road in a pothole. The only ghost I've ever heard of that haunted a pothole, only in Newfoundland, I think, that happened. Aunt Sadie lived by herself for a long time after that, after Uncle Mose died. And she was the woman in town that people would stay with. She kind of had a bit of a boarding house. So anyone that came to Britannia would stay with her. So if a minister or a lawyer or someone came in, that would be where they would stay. When the magistrate came, that's where they would stay. And everyone would go and visit. And she was said to be a very strict woman, but very, very kind. And she would always do something for people if she could. And she loved music. In her house, she had one of those old pump organs in the parlor. And anyone that came over, before they left Aunt Sadie's house, they had to sing a song or play a musical instrument. There had to be something music. She loved music. When Aunt Sadie Curry was in her 70s, towards the end of the year, when the squash berries were ready for picking, she went out to pick berries. And at the end of the day, somehow she got turned around, and instead of coming out of the woods, she went further in. And she didn't come home that night. She was in her late 70s at this point. And so when Aunt Sadie didn't come home, people were worried about her, of course. And so people went out looking for her, but they couldn't find her. And the next day, more people went out. People from Britannia and Petley and Lower Lance Cove, they all went out looking for Aunt Sadie. But no one could find her anywhere. And Aunt Betty remembered being a young girl at this time, a little bit older than some of the other children. And so she was the one that looked after all the kids while all the adults in Britannia went out looking for the missing Aunt Sadie Curry. And she was gone for days and days, no sign of her. They searched the ponds, they searched the woods, they searched along the shoreline, thinking that maybe she had fallen in, but no one could find her. Now, someone somehow had a crate of oranges, and that was a rare thing in those days. If you were lucky, you might get an orange in the toe of your stocking at Christmas, and that might be the only time you'd see an orange, and even then it was a rare thing to have. And somebody somehow had a whole crate of them. And they had the bright idea that these bright objects, they would take them out into the woods, and they would leave them there. And they would be there so bright and shining in the woods that if Aunt Sadie saw them, she would know that people were looking for her, that she would have something to eat. Anyway, time passed. 11 days and 11 nights. And one night a man from Britannia went back to a section of the woods that he had already searched. And there was Aunt Sadie Curry, sitting underneath a tree, surrounded by all these oranges. And he said, "Aunt Sadie, I've come to take you home." And he did. He led her home. And she had bug bites on her face, like you would if you'd been in the woods for a few days. But she wasn't cold, and she wasn't wet, and she wasn't tired, and she wasn't hungry. And after that, Nan Leawood went and stayed with her for a bit and looked after her. And when people asked her where she had been for those 11 days and 11 nights, she said she had been away, that she had been taken away by the fairies. And it was the fairies that had gone through the woods and had collected all these oranges and brought them to her. That it was the fairies that had kept her safe and kept her warm and had fed her with all these oranges. And when people asked her, up until the day she died, and she lived for years and years afterwards, when people asked her what it was like to be away for all that time, Aunt Sadie said, "Oh, the music. They played such beautiful music." And that's my story.